Following my recent video where I expressed my thoughts about the forthcoming Renters Reform Bill, which I consider to be an absolute joke, I have been inundated with questions, comments and suggestions from both landlords and tenants alike. I believe that the Renters Reform Bill is an absolute joke. It will do nothing to help protect tenants or landlords or the private rental sector as a whole. Even the very threat of these ridiculous measures being implemented has been reason enough for hundreds of thousands of private landlords to bail out. In fact, the official figures for Section 21s for the last quarter is just over 70,000. I believe that nothing could be further in the truth. As I understand it, from all of the landlord forums, the true number is in the hundreds of thousands, and in fact landlords can't even get to court to enforce an eviction because the courts are backed up for at least 9 months, pushing a year now, and it will only get worse. So I will be going live later on to answer your questions, and hopefully I can address some of your concerns and some of your suggestions. But in the meantime, I would like to forward some suggestions of my own, because keep in mind, this bill is only going through Parliament. It doesn't need to be implemented. It can be stopped. But for this to happen, it could only happen if landlords and tenants alike work together as a partnership, which is how it should be. As I've said previously, landlords need tenants, otherwise they have an asset that is a liability. Tenants or potential tenants need a landlord, otherwise they will have nowhere to live. This crisis has been exacerbated by the knee-jerk reactions of the government. Properties in the private rental sector are being depleted. People can't move around with their jobs. They can't find a home, and the problem is getting worse and worse all the time. However, many tenants are under the impression that if or when the Renters Reform Bill is implemented, that it will actually give them more rights to stay in their property. This is questions from tenants who have had a Section 21, or they believe that they will be receiving a Section 21 because the landlord wants to sell. Well, allow me to point it out to you that one of the fundamental criteria, grounds for possession of a property in the Renters Reform Bill is if the landlord wants to sell or move into the property. That will be automatic and it will not be contestable. So those of you who are facing a Section 21, if you think that the Renters Reform Bill is going to prevent the landlord evicting you, it will do the opposite, because it will be a more straightforward process for landlords to take possession of the property should they wish to sell or should they wish to move in. However, like I've said many times, I believe that this is a partnership, and I believe that in order to address this, in order to work towards a better private rental sector going forward, there are certain issues that need to be addressed, and there are many things that could be done to ensure that the relationship is much more amicable, that landlords are much more professional, and tenants are both protected and also know where they stand. So here's a few of them I'd like to run by you, and I'd love to hear your feedback on these. First of all, I believe that we are long overdue the introduction of a minimum standards for rental property. The danger of anything like this is that local authorities tend to begin to use these things as a cash cow, and that cannot be allowed. There needs to be a certain criteria in order to establish that the property meets minimum standards, but this cannot be conducted by local authority. They are not allowed to set a fee for this, and it should be available to many different people to conduct, because this is not a a detailed survey of a property. It is a non-invasive survey. It is a once-over by somebody who is used to visiting properties and assessing their condition, be that an estate agent, be that a surveyor, be that an EPC assessor. There could be certain criteria, and these people could take some basic training so that they understand what they need to look for, what the standards are. Something like this could be conducted once a year for a very small fee to ensure that minimum standards are met, that tenants are happy and landlords know where they stand. And most landlords would not have any problem, the vast majority, but this would help to force the small minority of landlords who somehow expect their tenants to live in squalor and still pay them. It will force them to buck up or to get out. I also believe that there should be an introduction of a level 3 qualification for landlords before they are allowed to be landlords. Once again, this should not be a cash cow. There are many level 3 training courses available online for less than £50. There's no reason that something like this could not be part of it. And far from being something to single out landlords, it is as much or even more to protect them, because ignorance of the law is no defense, but ignorance of the law can literally get you into a lot of trouble. Those of you who've been landlords for many years before the gas safety certificate was introduced as a mandatory requirement, how many of you possibly bought a property that was in fairly good condition? You cleared it out, maybe decorated it, rented it out, put some tenants in, and waited until the boiler needed servicing or it broke before you actually had anybody even give the boiler any attention. Not because of any indifference, not because you intended to ignore the law, but you literally could have put other people's lives in danger by not having that boiler serviced and checked before you handed the keys to anyone. There are lots of landlords who may have done that, and it is purely through fate and fortune that there was not a tragedy. Therefore, landlords need to know what the laws are, because it is becoming extremely difficult not to break the law now, just as it is difficult not to break the law if you drive from one end of London to the other. So the only way to ensure that landlords understand their obligations, their responsibilities and their risks is for them to have some form of proper training, and for them to be assessed that they understand all of that training in some sort of a test. And a level 3 qualification would be more than enough. And once again, I do believe that any professional landlord would not object to this, because ultimately it is for the safety of the tenants, but in many ways it's just as much to protect the landlords from getting themselves into trouble. I also believe that there should be a significant incentive introduced by the government for renovating the 600,000 derelict or unfit for use properties throughout the UK. At a time when we were approaching a housing crisis, before we even got here, what does the government do? George Osborne introduced the 3% surcharge, and then in the last budget, the current Chancellor basically announced that he was all but eliminating the capital gains tax allowance. What incentive is that for the small developers to buy and renovate these derelict properties? Because it will not be the major developers who will do it. They don't care. They literally just want to build a new housing estate on the playing field where your children play, because that's quick and easy and more profitable. It is individual developers, people who love property, who would, given the right incentive, buy and lovingly renovate these properties, and whether they rent them, sell them on, these properties could then be brought back into use. Something needs to be done to encourage people to do so. It could include additional capital gains tax allowance, no stamp duty surcharge on these properties, although many of them are exempt already, provided that you know how to apply and to document that. There's many things that the government could do to encourage small developers to bring these properties back into use and to ensure that it is targeted. All of the incentives and benefits could be directed, for example, at properties that are no larger than, say, 150 square meters or something along those lines, and perhaps properties that are renovated, not properties that are then bought and then split into flats. Because personally, I'm not keen on that, because over the last 2 decades, the acceptable living space for people in this country has been becoming less and less and less, and more people are literally living like caged animals. There are hundreds of thousands of properties throughout the country, and I see no reason why they should not be renovated as is and restored and brought back into use with enough space for an individual to a whole family to use. On top of that, I believe that there could be tax incentives to encourage landlords to offer longer tenancies, because for somebody who wishes to rent somewhere and stay longer term, a 12-month AST basically means that by the time they settle in, they're only 8 months, 9 months away from their next Section 21. Well, considering that there are 4.5 million properties in the private rental sector, that means that there are millions of people out there who are basically living in temporary accommodation. On the other hand, many lenders object to ASTs of more than 12 months. So that also needs to be addressed. And as I've said, for landlords who are willing to rent their properties out on a longer term basis, and many are, because most landlords do not want to see a tenant who looks after their property and pays their rent leave for no reason. But as I said, there is also the issue with the lenders, and that's down to the government to force their hand. However, this raises another problem, which I previously discussed, which is the accidental landlords. And that also needs to be addressed, because we are reaching the point now where people cannot move around this country with their jobs. And that was the very reason that the AST was introduced in 1988, because the demographics of our workforce had changed from the days where people would get a job in the shoe factory at the bottom of their street and work there until they retired and got their golden clock. People move around with their jobs. But for example, now that the economy is slowing down, if somebody finds a job in a different part of the country, what do they do about renting a home if they can't rent one? So we need to address this. There needs to be certain exceptions. I do believe that people who are renting out their own home should be covered under a specific tenancy agreement for accidental landlords. For example, if you have lived in the property for the 12 months immediately preceding the rental of that property for a fixed period, it will be clear to the tenant that it is for a fixed period only. And when that owner wishes to return to their home, if the tenant doesn't leave, there should be a fast track court service so that they can recover their home, provided that they move into it and live in it for a certain amount afterwards, purely so that this law is not exploited. Otherwise, people who need to rent out their home to move with their work will be too scared to rent it out. So I do think that that needs to be covered. With regards to deposits, another contentious issue: when a tenancy comes to an end and there may be damage to a property, as many of you landlords will know, it's an absolute nightmare to deal with. Again, the very people who could take additional training to be qualified to certify a property reaches a minimum standard could be referred to as almost an independent inspector where there is a dispute, and that independent inspector, provided there has been a proper documented inventory, can compare the inventory with the current commission, and they can send their report off to the deposit protection scheme with whatever their findings are, and the deposit protection scheme would then be bound to return X amount or refund X amount of the deposit to the landlord for damages. That would help to prevent a lot of litigation and a lot of stress. As you can see, there are so many issues, and as I've said, for you tenants out there who are under the impression that the forthcoming Renters Reform Bill will help you to stay where you are, it will not, because a landlord wishing to sell a property is automatic grounds for the property to be repossessed or to take possession. There are quite a few other areas that I feel are erroneous. I feel that they don't help anyone, and I believe the only way forward is not just for a landlords association or a tenants association. It should be a private rental sector body with landlords and tenants alike as part of it, so that a mutually agreeable solution is found that would be of benefit to all. I'd love to hear your feedback. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye for now.